Okay, so now this would be the last set of ramblings on this theme of the decolonization of Africa until I start putting more formal presentations on how decolonization or independence was brought about in specific countries. This rambling just speak about, again, just a broad generalization of decolonization. After the Second World War, the first countries which became independent were those in North Africa. Obvious example being Libya, which got its independence in 1951. Libya was an Italian colony, and Italy was part of the Axis powers during the Second World War, fighting alongside Germany and Japan, and obviously on the losing side. And when the war ended, Britain had taken control over its colonies, and in 1951, Libya became independent. Egypt, which was kind of ruled by what was regarded as a foreign king or King Farouk. He was overthrown and by a military coup, and Egypt became fully independent, ruled by an Egyptian. Gamal Abdel Nasser would emerge as the individual that became the leader of Egypt. In 1956, Morocco and Tunisia became independent from France. Morocco and Tunisia, unlike many other parts of the continent, were already, don't want to generalize, but homogeneous regions which were colonized in the form of the Kingdom of Morocco and Tunisia. Most colonies in Africa, it was different because when they were colonized, they were not colonized based on any existing political structure, but it was just lines drawn up, which in most instances split up people and in some instances put together in one country groups that have been hostile to one another or different to one another for many centuries. The most famous example, obviously, being Nigeria, because Nigeria, on one hand, is made up of three large ethnic groups: the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Igbos in the southeast, and the Yoruba in the southwest. But even in these three territories, there's a lot of minority ethnic groups. So Nigeria is an example of a very diverse region, or the Belgium Congo, as today is called the DRC. Also, many different groups put into one country. Morocco and Tunisia, which got their independence in 1956, relatively straightforward. Now, in 1957, we can talk about perhaps the first, well, definitely the first sub-Saharan African country in the Second World War, after the Second World War period, to assert their independence, but also one of the first where we talk about a nationalist leader or a nationalist political party that brings about its own independence, forces the European power out. And this would be the Gold Coast, which in 1957, became the independent state of Ghana. Ghana, or Gold Coast, was a British colony which, in comparison to other colonies, was a good candidate to experiment with decolonization. Okay, so if you think about the Second World War and what happened during the Second World War, the signing of the Atlantic Charter, pressure on by the United States on Britain to decolonize. And this whole task of how do we bring this about? We know now that it's inevitable that the former colonies will become independent states, and they start looking at one which seems like it would be the best candidate. Ghana had good reserves, had a thriving cocoa industry. It didn't have a lot of European settlers, made it a good candidate. Europeans began to experiment by giving Africans more representation on the Legislative Council for the first time, led to a political body made up of professional class called the UGCC, the United Gold Coast Convention, and they needed a full-time organizer. At the same time, an individual, Kwame Nkrumah, who was born in the Gold Coast, from a minority ethnic group, who had studied abroad, went to the United States, studied at Lincoln University, got a lot of experience, played a major role in the Fifth Pan-African Congress in London in 1945, which was one of the first, well, the first Pan-African Congress that had Africans who were born on the continent. Prior to this, most of the Pan-African or all of the Pan-African conferences that had taken place were led by Africans who were born in the diaspora in the Americas. And this fifth Pan-African Congress conference was the first where Africans who were born in the continent played a huge role, and it also put um, the decolonization of the continent on the agenda. Nkrumah made a name for himself during this time, and back at home, the United Gold Coast Convention needed a full-time organizer. They invited Kwame Nkrumah to come back, and when he arrived, there was also a lot of demonstration by former servicemen who had fought, Ghanaian soldiers who had fought in the Second World War, frustrated of conditions back at home, protested, led to the police opening fire, killing a few, caused countrywide riots, led to the UGCC leaders, which included Kwame Nkrumah at this time, being put in prison. After they were released from prison, Kwame Nkrumah eventually broke away, formed his own Convention People's Party, and eventually brought about the liberation of Ghana. The following year, in 1958, Guinea, a French colony, became independent. Ahmed Sékou Touré, who was I wouldn't say a follower, but generally same ideology as Kwame Nkrumah, wanted independence. France at this time was hoping that, unlike Britain, France was hoping that their colonies would want to continue to be part of the French Empire, and they left it up to a vote. And most of the French colonies voted to remain part of Greater France, but Guinea and Sékou Touré was one who voted against it. And the way in which the French treated Guinea after this actually led to the other French colonies deciding that they do not want to be part of the French Empire anymore. And many of them achieved their independence, like Niger, Mauritania, the Central African Republic, just to name a few. And in 1960, this would be known as the Year of Africa, where many, many African colonies, French and also some British as well, got their independence. But another former colony which got its independence during this time was the Belgium Congo, today called the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this independence was very different to the way in which British colonies got their independence. Like the Gold Coast, you could think of it as being a good candidate to experiment with independence. And the Congo was not. The Congo, and there's a lot of good videos on YouTube to explore this topic. There's a lot of good books on this topic as well. But the Congo's colonial period, colonial experience was different in comparison to other African countries. It was extremely brutal. And it was done predominantly not by a government, by a monarch, King Leopold II of Belgium, and he ruled over the Congo and through concession companies. One of the most brutal instances of human rights abuses in the pursuit of profit, absolutely horrendous. Scandal was emerging, and he sold the colony to Belgium in 1908, and he died in 1909. And Belgium took over this colony that they didn't actually want. But when they inherited this colony, there was massive mineral wealth. And from the period of 1908 until the Second World War, Belgium became more and more dependent on this colony, especially for resources, and especially the region of Katanga, very, very rich in minerals. Congo is one of the richest places in the world in terms of minerals. And Belgium could not conceive a future. You know, even though they didn't originally colonize it, it was done by their monarch. Belgium inherited this colony, but after they got the colony, they benefited immensely, and they were not ready to even talk about independence. But suddenly, the rest of Africa's decolonizing, and like in 1957, when news of Ghanaian independence reaches the Congolese, and some of them would read about this, it motivated them to start agitating for independence. And the story of what happened here is very, very controversial about Belgium's plans of stalling independence. What eventually happened is that very reluctantly in 1960, they gave the Congo independence. But the individual who would emerge as the democratic leader was also someone who would be perceived by outside powers. And again, there's also excellent videos that you can watch on this. Patrice Lumumba. And Belgium wanted him out, the United States wanted him out, and there were a lot of plots to have him assassinated, but to make it look like it was done by his Congolese rivals. But the importance of this is that it happened very, very soon after independence. In June 1960, the Congo gets independence, and within a couple of weeks, there's a mutiny in the army, there's rioting, there's eventually a coup d'etat that takes place. Joseph Desiree Mobutu, who was put in charge of the army by Lumumba, would later stab Lumumba in the back and declare a military coup. And while Africa, the year of Africa, 1960, when many countries are gaining their independence, this is a bad omen of what's to come, because here's the first example of a military coup following the independence period. Eventually, Lumumba is assassinated, with the United States and Belgium playing a key role, as well as his Congolese rivals, and it creates or initiates this Congo crisis. But it's also just a reminder that while there is this optimism and euphoria about African independence, the reality is it's not as simple as that. There's outside forces, there's the Cold War taking place, there's some European powers that do not want to leave and want to maintain some of their influence on the continent. And it played out in a very ugly manner in the Congo, but it would happen shortly thereafter in other parts of Africa as well. So it was almost a warning sign of bad things to come. So at the same time that, there's this euphoria and excitement about decolonization, there's also this. But it's also important to note that it's not just this. There's the Algerian War of Independence as well, where France, although it gave some of its colonies independence, it was committed to stay in Algeria. That led to a civil war. And in fact, the civil war that was taking place in Algeria was one of the reasons that Belgium kind of reluctantly let the Congo get into independence in 1960, even though it didn't want to, because it wanted to avoid a situation that the French faced in Algeria. There was also the problem of South Africa, where the country was ruled by a white minority, and whereas most of Africa is moving towards democracy, South Africa is further entrenching segregation and that exists in it, and it's moving towards apartheid, which begins in 1948 when the National Party comes to power. So even though African countries are getting their independence, it's very difficult for them to assert their dominance on the world stage, because independence is not happening uniformly, and it is happening with conditions, and it's happening in a very, very hostile international world, which is characterized by the Cold War. And in the Congo, Patrice Lumumba would be labeled as choosing the wrong side, because when secessionist groups were breaking out in Congo, he needed assistance, and he wasn't getting the assistance he wanted from the West. He took Soviet assistance, which led to him being perceived as a communist. So a lot of very difficult things which were happening at this time. Nonetheless, that period from the 1960s afterwards, a lot of other colonies would get their independence. Nigeria would get its independence, Cameroon, Tanganyika eventually would merge with Zanzibar and become Tanzania, etc. But there's another exception to this period of decolonization, and that is the former Portuguese colonies, specifically Angola and Mozambique. While most European powers have been moving out, Portugal remained committed to stay in Africa, and their argument was that, although the scramble for Africa took place in the 1880s, they had already began their inroads in Africa more early. In fact, the first European explorers who passed Africa, or who explored the coast, the first to visit the coastal regions of Africa, were Portuguese explorers, and they had made inroads in Angola and Mozambique very early on, and they remained committed to prevent these areas from becoming independent. And whereas most of the colonies began to get their independence, Portugal declared Angola and Mozambique as being provinces of Portugal. And in various parts of Portuguese colonies in Africa, resistance movements broke out, and Portugal fought very bloody wars in Africa. But in 1974, there was a revolution within Portugal, partly motivated by just frustration among soldiers of continuing to fight in Africa, and they had actually got frustrated, and you had a coup d'etat in 1974, and the new government that took over Portugal wanted out, and that's how Angola got its Angola, Mozambique, and various other Portuguese colonies got their independence in 1974 and 1975. Then the other exceptions of colonial, well, colonies getting their independence, what was Southern Rhodesia, today it's Zimbabwe. There was a white minority government that was emerged over there, unilaterally broke away from Great Britain, and eventually it was overthrown in 1980, and Zimbabwe became independent. Namibia was controlled by South Africa from the period after the First World War. During the First World War, South African troops played a role in defeating the Germans who had colonized Namibia, and South Africa controlled Namibia. Namibia only got its independence in 1990, Eritrea in 1993, and Sudan eventually, South Sudan broke away in 2011. So these are just some of the ways in which decolonization happened in Africa. But the next videos, which will be on this topic, will be slightly more formal presentations on the different experiences of independence and how decolonization played out. Thank you.